Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack a truly defining era of history. We're going to explore the dramatic internal fractures of the early Indian national movement, specifically zooming in on those crucial years between 1885 and 1919. This isn't just a simple story about a unified front pushing back against colonial rule. It's actually a really fascinating, complex narrative about clashing ideologies, bitter internal rivalries, and the explosive events that literally changed the trajectory of the subcontinent forever.
Here is how we'll break it down today. First, moderates versus extremists. Second, the rise of extremism. Third, the partition of Bengal. Fourth, boycotts and broken ties. And finally, a changed political landscape.
Let's start right at the top with Section 1, Moderates versus Extremists, and their ideological clash.
To really understand this dynamic, we have to look at who these people actually were, because the starkest contrast between these two factions was their mass base. On one side, you have the moderates. They were often called the early nationalists, and they were fundamentally an elite, English-speaking class. They genuinely admired the political institutions of England. On the other hand, the extremists drew their strength from a completely different demographic. They represented the urban middle class, were heavily influenced by Arya Samaji's thought, and saw themselves not as British subjects seeking a voice, but as fierce cultural nationalists.
Naturally, these contrasting backgrounds completely dictated how they operated. The moderates had this underlying faith in the British sense of justice. In fact, they weren't strictly against British rule itself, but rather what they called the un-British character of how India was being governed at the time. Their methodology was intensely polite and strictly constitutional. They relied entirely on what became famous as the 4 Ps: prayer, petition, persuasion, and philanthropy. They really believed they could just reason their way to better governance. Now, contrast that polite, patient persuasion with this absolutely fiery assertion from extremist leader Aurobindo Ghosh. He said political freedom is life breath of any nation. The extremists completely rejected those 4 Ps. Instead, they championed the doctrine of passive resistance and organized boycotts. Leaders like Ghosh believed in adding a deeply emotional, even religious touch to nationalism, famously referring to the nation as the motherland, or Matrabhumi. It was just an entirely different emotional frequency. So the crucial point of friction is how these two factions defined their ultimate objective, a concept known as Swaraj. For moderate leaders like Gopal Krishna Gokhale and Dadabhai Naoroji, Swaraj simply meant self-government, but crucially, it was a self-government that would be achieved through gradual persuasion and continued cooperation with the British. Essentially, they wanted a seat at the table. They definitely didn't want to flip the table over.
But for the extremists, famously led by the trio of Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Bipin Chandra Pal, alongside Aurobindo Ghosh, Swaraj was completely redefined. They didn't want a seat at the table. They wanted to own the entire room. For them, Swaraj meant absolute self-rule, and it wasn't something you politely asked for. It had to be demanded unequivocally as a matter of right. You can immediately see how this fundamental divergence in goals and methods set the stage for an inevitable collision.
Which brings us to Section 2, the rise of extremism, fueled by both global and local sparks.
To figure out why this happened when it did, we first have to look outside of India's borders. Massive global underdog victories, like Ethiopia defeating Italy in 1897 and, crucially, Japan defeating Russia in the War of 1904 to 1905, sent absolute shockwaves around the world. These events completely shattered the long-standing myth of European military and racial invincibility. For the Indian populace, watching an Asian nation defeat a major European power massively energized them. It gave them real hope that British dominance wasn't permanent.
And back at home, things were heating up too. The entry of Arya Samajists into the Indian National Congress brought fiery new slogans into the mainstream. Words like Swaraj, Swadeshi, and, quite boldly, India for Indians. At the exact same time, you have leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak ingeniously organizing mass public events. He used the Shivaji and Ganesh festivals as a symbolic cultural starting point for opposition to foreign rule. Tilak also amplified this message through his weekly newspapers, organizing the masses in a way the moderates simply never attempted.
All of this tension needed a spark, which leads us to Section 3, the partition of Bengal, the ultimate catalyst.
The crisis escalated at a breakneck pace. In 1903, the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, announced the intention to partition the massive province of Bengal.
by 1905, right amid some dramatic internal British administrative disputes that actually led to Curzon's resignation, the new viceroy, Lord Minto, officially announced the partition plan on October 16, 1905. This move directly triggered the highly contentious Surat Session of the Indian National Congress later that same year.
Now, officially, the British claimed this was purely for administrative reasons. Bengal was huge, they argued, and just too hard to govern as one unit. But internal communications reveal the real story. In a letter from British official Herbert Hope Risley to Curzon, the true motive is laid bare. He wrote, "Bengal united is a power. Bengal divided will pull Bengal in several different ways. It was a calculated, deliberate divide-and-rule strategy, designed explicitly to crush the rising nationalist tide that was centered right there in Bengal."
The reaction from the public was immediate, and it was fierce. The extremists actually charged the moderates with effectively encouraging the British to go this far because of their passive tactics. Meanwhile, massive resistance mobilized. Iconic figures like Rabindranath Tagore brilliantly countered the division with powerful displays of cultural unity. He initiated Raksha Banding Diwas specifically to symbolize and cement Hindu-Muslim unity in the face of colonial division. He also composed the deeply emotional cultural anthem Amar Sonar Bangla, basically weaponizing art and culture against the partition.
With Bengal fractured, the internal war spilled out into the open in Section 4, Boycotts and Broken Ties.
The ideological rift we talked about earlier had now become a very urgent tactical crisis. At that 1905 Benares session, the extremists looked at the partition of Bengal and demanded a massive, radical response. They wanted an all-India boycott movement, including a total boycott of the legislature itself. They wanted to take the fight everywhere. The moderates, clinging tightly to their constitutional approach, desperately tried to pump the brakes. They insisted the partition was a local Bengal problem that required only a local protest movement. Ultimately, moderate President Gokhale managed to force a compromise, keeping the boycott restricted to Bengal, but the cracks were now massive.
Well, the very next year, at the 1906 Calcutta session, the extremists pushed even harder. To avoid a total split of the Congress right then and there, the moderates were forced to swallow a bitter pill. Under the presidency of the elder statesman Dadabhai Naoroji, 4 highly aggressive resolutions championed by the extremists were passed: Boycott, Swadeshi, meaning using locally made goods over British ones, Swaraj, and national education. The extremists were clearly setting the agenda now.
But as you might guess, the peace simply couldn't hold. By 1907, the British government actually persuaded the moderates to backtrack on those bold Calcutta resolutions. This was the final straw. At the 1907 Surat Session, the extremists demanded strict adherence to the resolutions, and chaos ensued. The result was the infamous Surat Split. Moderate President Ras Bahari Ghosh formally expelled the primary extremist leaders, Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Bipin Chandra Pal, from all Congress activities. The Indian national movement had officially broken in two.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, a changed political landscape.
We absolutely can't look at this fracture without looking at another massive shift happening at the exact same time. In 1906, right as the Congress was tearing itself apart, the Muslim League was established by Nawab Salimullah of Dhaka. An immediate catalyst for this was the intense Hindu-Urdu language controversy. The Muslim League's explicit early objectives were to consolidate loyalty and union with the British and intentionally stop Muslim participation in the activities of the Congress. And, most consequentially, they demanded separate electorates for Muslims, introducing a massive new religious division into the political architecture.
Meanwhile, the British ruthlessly capitalized on the newly fractured Indian National Congress. With the moderates having kicked out the extremists, the colonial government swooped right in and decapitated the radical leadership. Bal Gangadhar Tilak was charged with sedition and imprisoned for 6 years in a jail in Mandalay, Burma. Lala Lajpat Rai was essentially expelled and settled in America. Aurobindo Ghosh, after facing conspiracy and bomb case charges, retired from active politics entirely to become a philosopher in Pondicherry. The extremist threat was brutally, effectively neutralized for the time being.
But here's the thing. Even though the leadership was gone, the unrest they had sparked forced the hand of the British. In a stunning reversal at the 1911 Delhi Durbar, King George V actually canceled the partition of Bengal. He separated Bihar from Bengal and shifted the entire capital of India away from the turbulent hotbed of Calcutta, moving it to Delhi. But the British thought they had crushed the extremist threat, only to realize the radical seeds were already deeply sown. If you want proof that the 4 Ps were forever replaced in the minds of some by violent resistance, look no further than 1912, when revolutionary Ras Bihari Bose threw a bomb directly at the new viceroy, Lord Hardinge II, right there in Delhi.
The British had fundamentally changed the game. Through the 1909 Government of India Act, based on the Morley Minto reforms, they officially granted those separate electorates demanded by the Muslim League. And the wild part is, the British themselves knew exactly what they had done by codifying this religious division into law. During discussions, Lord Morley chillingly noted the dangerous impact, stating, "By granting separate electorates, we are sowing dragon's teeth, harvest of which will be very bitter."
Which leaves us with this crucial, lingering thought to close out our explainer today. We've seen how the Indian national movement fractured between moderates seeking a seat at the table and extremists demanding the whole house. We've seen how colonial powers exploited this with partition and separate electorates. When the very foundations of a freedom struggle are built on such deep institutionalized divisions, what kind of nation or nations will eventually rise from the ashes? It's a bitter harvest indeed. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.